Hi everybody, welcome to Dynamo Sword Channel. I'm David and today on Dynamo Sword Channel I will be reviewing the Windlass Legend of Zelda Master Sword. So how does this sword fare as the only production version of the Master Sword in its price range, as well as hold up to the video game design it's based on? Well, stay tuned, we'll find out. So being a fantasy sword based on a video game design, this sword doesn't have any actual historical info to discuss. What it does have, though, is a rich and long-built history of its origin and use through the Legend of Zelda series. So this historical overview will be based on the in-game lore of the Master Sword. Also, just so you know, as a side note, I do have a video discussing my theories on what historical European sword inspired the design of the Master Sword. So if you'd like to check that out, there will be a link in the description. So let's get on to the lore of the Master Sword. The Master Sword is one of the oldest swords in the history of Hyrule, the land the Legend of Zelda series takes place in. In the game Skyward Sword, we see the Master Sword get its beginning as an enhanced version of the Goddess Sword. Now, this sword was originally wielded by the goddess Hyla when she defended the good races of Hyrule against the Demon King Demise. Many years later, the goddess's chosen hero, Link, is guided to the goddess sword, housed in a secret underground shrine beneath the goddess statue, atop his floating island home of Skyloft. It is here that he meets his guide, Fi, a spirit of the sword and attendant to the goddess Hyla, who has been tasked with guiding Link through his adventure to save his friend Zelda, who has fallen from the sky to the surface below. Now, through this game, Link enhances the goddess sword with sacred flames, evolving it into the Master Sword. The final step of its creation being a sacred blessing from Zelda, who is revealed to be the reincarnation of the goddess Hyla, empowering it as the true sword of evil's bane, capable of defeating the Demon King Demise once and for all. After Link defeats Demise, he lays the sword to rest in the pedestal of time at the sacred grounds, where it will rest idle until a time where it's needed again, drawn by another hero to defeat evil and defend Hyrule. Now, even though canonically this is the origin and or creation story of the Master Sword, Skyward Sword isn't technically the first time we see the Master Sword in the games. Before, there was a Master Sword in the first two titles of the series, 1986's The Legend of Zelda and 1998's Zelda 2: The Adventure of Link, released on the Nintendo Entertainment System. The sword that would become the Master Sword was simply named the Magic Sword. But we could see, especially in the cover art of Zelda 2, the Magic Sword was meant to be the Master Sword, but with the limited detail of the original 8-bit games and lack of focused lore, it was simply known as the Magic Sword. Its actual origin to the series came in the 16-bit third installment of the series, 1991's Link to the Past, released on the Super Nintendo, where the Master Sword is introduced as an ancient sword created by the ancient Highland race to defeat evil. In this game, Link must acquire 3 pendants of virtue to claim the sword and face the evil Ognem, who is threatening the land. The next canonical use of the Master Sword is many years forward in the Zelda timeline in the 4th installment of the series, the 1998 released Ocarina of Time on the Nintendo 64. In this game, Link must acquire 3 sacred stones from various regions of Hyrule to open the Door of Time, which is in the Temple of Time, where the Master Sword rests in its pedestal. He does this at the behest of a young princess, Zelda, who tasks him to help combat the evil Gerudo king Ganondorf, who is threatening to conquer and usurp the kingdom of Hyrule. Now, canonically speaking, this is the second game to feature the Master Sword, with the sword actually resting in its pedestal that it was placed in at the end of Skyward Sword, and then it being first used since Skyward Sword canonically in Ocarina of Time. Now, from Ocarina of Time, the Master Sword will become the staple weapon of the series, featured in such titles as The Oracles of Season and Ages, released on Game Boy Color, The Wind Waker, which was released on the Nintendo GameCube, Twilight Princess, which released on the GameCube as well as the Nintendo Wii, Link Between Worlds, which released on 3DS, and most recently Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, which released on the Nintendo Switch. Now, as you can see, the Master Sword has had a long and storied history, one that has evolved and enriched itself through the stories told through the years by the series it's a part of. So now let's look at the overall statistics of this sword. So its overall length is 37.5 inches. It has a weight of 3¾ pounds with a point of balance right at about 2.5 inches from the hilt. The center of percussion is right at about 18 inches from the hilt. And the class of sword is what I would consider a fantasy hand and a half sword. Now, the blade's total length is 27 inches, and its total edged blade is 21 3/8 inches from the little swell here. Now, its blade width is 1 3/8, and it actually widens to about 1.5 inches at the swell, and then goes back to the 1 3/8 up to the tip. Now, the material steel is 1075 high carbon steel, and it has a nice, attractive mirror finish. Now, the cross section is diamond, and it is fullered for most of the blade length, so about 7/8 of the blade you could say is fullered. Now, the blade type is primarily fantasy in design. There's no real historical example of it. It is very similar to, I guess you could say, like an Oakshot type XA, but in general, it would just be considered a fantasy blade, or you could say it is the Evil's Bane type if you wanted to kind of play with the lore. Now, onto the guard. The guard's total length is 7 3/4 inches at the wings here. The lower guard here portion is about 5 inches, and the guard width is a 1/2 inch by a 1/2 inch, and then the wings are about 7/8 of an inch and swell out. The Quillian dimensions again, so you got about 1.5 inch at the bottom here, and that kind of goes to about a 1/4 inch on the sides, and that tapers down to about an inch here, and then stays about 1/4 of an inch. So the wings are about, an inch up to an inch and a half. Now, the material is a solid darkened brass, and much like the general sword itself, it is a fantasy guard. There's nothing that really matches it historically, and is pretty much its own very unique design, designed by the Zelda designers. So on to the handle. The handle's total length is 7 1/4 inches, with the grip material section being about 6 3/8 of an inch. The handle material is wood core, and the grip material finish is a nice dark blue leather with a crisscross riser pattern, and then featuring, it's actually part of the whole hilt guard, but has the ringlet here at the bottom that adds to the grip. Now, the pommel's total length is 2.5 inches. The pommel circumference around at the width is about 5 inches, and that tapers down to about 3 3/4 inch at the grip. The material, like the guard, is a darkened brass, and the hilt construction is an internal flathead nut that recesses into the pommel. Now, the pommel type is, of course, like the whole sword, fantasy, but it does show historical similarities to a oak shot type T. One of the highlights of this sword is it comes with a well-crafted and detailed scabbard. Now, it features a wood core and is wrapped in a nice dark blue leather. It is detailed in white leather following the design of the various in-game scabbards, while having a little uniqueness of its own. Now, unlike the game scabbard, which features metallic gold accents, including a collar and chape, this scabbard has no metal adornments aside from the little belt loop ringlets. Now, focusing on, they kind of more focused on simulating them with the outer leather and giving it sort of less of a metallic appeal, but just a general design appeal. Now, one thing you obviously noticed is mine isn't white like the stock scabbard. Well, that is because, like most of my swords, this one has received a little customization to it. I used gold leather paint to match the in-game color scheme of blue and gold. Now, regarding fit, this scabbard fits this sword actually really well. There's no real rattle. Most of that rattle you're hearing is actually the little belt loops. And the mouth fits very flush to the hilt. And, for the most part, has, a pretty decent friction fit for its type. I mean, it's not going to really hold upside down, but you don't have to worry about it jutting out if, you move it or shake it. Overall, it is an impressive scabbard that adds much to the overall, presentation of the sword as a package. The only thing I don't like are these two little belt rings featured to carry it. I think they kind of throw off the overall look of the scabbard. And then plus, I mean, yeah, you can, use them and, kind of hang the sword at your hip. But as we all know, being Zelda fans, even though it's not really, accurate or taboo, this sword is meant to be strapped to the back, which the ringlets don't really give you any benefit of actually doing. This sword was initially released on the website of the sword vendor Bud K. I remember when it first released, as it sparked quite a debate on the Sword Buyer Guide forums. The actual focus of the discussion was this sword actually functional and, worthy regarding fit and finish, as well as just being generally curious on who actually was making it. Now, soon after, we got a few answers to our questions and learned that it was actually Windlass Steelcrafts of India who was making the sword, which was later confirmed with the sword showing up on their retail site, Museum Replicas. Now, being made by Windlass did rest a few of the members' concerns, including me, on its durability, but just how really functional is it? Soon after, a full review of the sword was done by Shad on his channel, Shadiversity, who not only gave a great review of the sword itself, but put it through its paces with various destructive durability tests, confirming that this is a true functional production level replica of the Master Sword and just as well built and durable as any of Windlass's other functional swords they offer. The blade of this sword, as mentioned, resembles a thinner version of one of Windlass's, medieval European or Viking style swords. It is rather short at only 27 inches, but it is nicely finished with crisp lines and does come sharp out of the box with a beveled edge. The blade has a unique swell at a quarter of the blade's length to simulate that design feature of the Master Sword. What it lacks, though, is the Triforce engraving, as well as a more wasted ricasso below the swell, which, kind of does distract a little from the blade looking more authentic. I also feel the blade would look better with a more average 30 to 32 inch blade length and be a little broader with, about a 2-inch width. I think Windlass's classic medieval sword blade would have actually been perfect, in my opinion, to simulate, this sword relative to the actual current blade. Now, the hilt is where this sword shines and gives the true appearance of, the Master Sword. The guard is made of a very excellently crafted and molded solid brass, featuring a darkened finish. Now, the winged quillions and downward curved lower guard match the sword design quite excellently. The upper portion of the guard that fits the ricasso is, kind of a little bulky, but it's all right, but it does seem a little off, and it is definitely a lot bulkier than the initial Master Sword design. Now, I'm sure, kind of like a habaki on a katana, it helps with the friction fit to the scabbard. So I guess you could say, to an extent, it does have its purpose. The finish to the guard is smooth, and there are no ugly casting marks or blemishes. The darkened finish is nice, and though not the traditional blue or violet blue of the game sword, it does add character and kind of more of a realistic version of the hilt. It also makes it similar to the royal broadsword from Breath of the Wild, as that sword too features a more bronze golden hued hilt. Now, another detraction from the original design, and one that honestly I prefer, is the removal of the semicircle portion of the lower guard. Now, personally, I've always found it to be an odd, bulky inclusion to the hilt design of the Master Sword, and I'm honestly glad it isn't featured on this functional sword. Now, onto the grip. The grip is nice and attractive, featuring an upper brass ringlet and a wood core with that nice dark blue leather overwrap with that crisscross pattern risers. It is, in my opinion, a little on kind of the bulky side in the middle, but it's not so much that it's not grippable or unwieldable. It is side stitched, which is kind of the norm for most windlass leather overwraps. I mean, overall, it is a nice grip that, could maybe use just a little more slimming in the profile, in my personal opinion. As mentioned before, though, it is kind of odd being, kind of as long as it is, being two-handed. That is, kind of sort of unnatural to an extent for the Master Sword. But yeah, overall, nice grip. The pommel is nicely cast and finished too, but does, lack the authentic look of the initial Master Sword design. It is made of brass like the guard and features a matching darkened finish. Now, historically speaking, I said that before. It does kind of look like a basic Type T pommel in the Oakshot typology, which kind of does add kind of more to its functionality and general comfortability of use. But again, overall, as far as its finish, the lines are nice and smooth, evenly cast, and not sharp, so it is comfortable when gripped. Now, the pommel has a small recession on the bottom with an internal flattened flathead nut, which is how the sword's construction is finished. Now, this may be a pro or con to some, kind of depending on how you look at it. On the pro side, it means the sword can be disassembled for customization or repair. But as a con, it means the sword doesn't have, a more sounder peen construction, which could mean potential loosening of the hilt over extended use, like most internal nut pommels. Now, regarding handling, I was, kind of impressed with how this sword handles, compared to the Conan Atlantean fantasy sword I reviewed earlier on the channel. I initially expected this sword to handle similarly and be much more cumbersome. To my surprise, that's actually just the opposite, as this sword feels really good in the hand and is actually really nicely balanced. At nearly 4 pounds, it's definitely not a light sword, but by any means, it is not, one that's really hard to handle one-handed at all. I'm sure this has a lot to do with, the point of balance being very close to the hilt, and of course, the shorter stature of the sword. Again, when discussing pros and cons, in hindsight, it might have been kind of a con if they opted for a longer, broader blade, which would definitely have added that extra weight. Now, this sword too features a rather long grip, much longer than one would expect on a 27-inch blade. At 7 inches overall, it definitely has very adequate space for 2 hands to use. Now, there is a debate regarding just what the Master Sword is. I mean, yes, it's a fantasy sword, but what does it fit more into? The arming sword, single-handed sword category, or more of a two-handed longsword type? Now, earlier renditions of the Master Sword show it to be more of an arming sword, while later versions show it being more hand and a half or longsword in proportion. This later version kind of started with Twilight Princess and basically has continued through, with Skyward Sword and Breath of the Wild, and now in the latest game of the series, Tears of the Kingdom. Now, this short blade, long handle design kind of has, a little disproportionate look to it. Though, looks aside, it, again, really handles very well and is comfortable to use both one and two-handed. Overall, I'm actually very impressed with how this sword handles, especially as a fantasy sword that, you would expect to be kind of more heavy and bulky like the Atlantean. Now, based on Shad's destructive testing, I feel it would do very well cutting light to medium targets, and definitely recommend it for, such practices. Overall, I really like this replica of the Master Sword. I mean, it's not perfect by any means, but before this sword, there were only 2 ways to have a replica of the Master Sword. Either purchase one of the display-only models of, various quality, or go with a custom smith, which puts the buyer at a price point around 10 times this production sword's retail price. As well as, what normally comes with custom swords that are, handmade, a long completion wait time. Now, of course, this sword isn't anywhere near as finely crafted as some of those custom versions offered. especially those done by Brendan at Fable Blades or Jeffrey at Bronze by Jeffrey Robinson. Those are really true masterpieces that, anyone would love and appreciate. But, what this is a functional and, very well handling sword. And that does give it a step above those display swords. Even if you only plan on displaying it, still at least you have, basically a real master sword rather than, one of them rat tail stainless, display swords. Now, there was one more functional master sword offered a few years back that was made by BCI and sold through the Sword Buyer's Guide store. But those unfortunately had reports of casting flaws with the guards and unfortunately didn't last long on the market and only had kind of one run after the, issues were found. So yeah, this sword might not be a perfect replica of the Legend of Zelda Master Sword, but it does check 3 boxes most sword collectors will appreciate. It's functional, it's affordable, and the design captures the majority of what a functional Master Sword can or could be at a $300 price point. Now put those 3 together and, adding in it being, definitely one of the most popular and renowned video game weapons of all time makes this Windlass Master Sword a great collector's item for the millions of fans of Legend of Zelda series, as well as general sword enthusiasts alike. Well, that's going to be it for this review. I hope you enjoyed viewing it and it helps with your decision on if or not to purchase this sword. Now be sure to like and subscribe, and as well as look out for future content from Dynamo Sword channel. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.